For our last session of the day and for our conference, we have asked another old friend of the museum, Dr. Conrad Crane, to come to the podium to moderate the next session. Con?
Well, it's been clear from the questions on the previous panels that the atomic bomb is of great interest to this audience. One of the subtitles for this panel in the program refers to the decision to use the bomb as a key subject. You know, historians have tended to look at this issue from the wrong direction. There really was no decision to use the bomb, just like there was no decision whether to use the B-17 or whether to use the B-29 or whether to use the M1 rifle. What would have been necessary was a decision not to use the bomb, which is a much different issue. In 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson convened an interim committee to examine the use of the new weapon. Except for a 10-minute conversation between a few participants over lunch one day, all the committee discussions were about how to use the bomb, never whether to use the bomb. The moral angst over the dropping of the atomic bomb is really a product of the 1960s. For the World War II generation, the bomb ended their war. For the Cold War generation, it started theirs. We have two very knowledgeable presenters here today. Their bios are in your program, so like everybody else, I'm not going to go into great detail. Robert Norris is going to cover the Herculean effort to build the bomb. The two most expensive development programs of World War II were the B-29 and the Manhattan Project, and the United States did both. Other nations looking at atomic programs had to decide whether to pursue a bomb based on uranium or one based on plutonium, both processes extremely complex and expensive. The US pursued both at the same time. Dr. Norris will focus particularly on the important role played by General Leslie Groves. He'll be followed by Richard Frank with an attempt to describe the complex end of the war in the Pacific and the key role the atomic bomb played. He'd probably need about 3 days to do it, but he's got, I guess, you know, there's no one I know who can do it better, especially in 20 minutes. So.
Well, thank you very much. As Conrad said, I'm going to look at General Leslie Groves. If you're not familiar with him, I've written a biography of his life, which doubles really as an alternate history of the Manhattan Project. I think that most of you who know something about the Manhattan Project, the historiography has been towards the scientists. They've been center stage. Oppenheimer, Los Alamos, and they're the heroes. And Groves got pushed off to the wings of the stage. And what I thought I would do is put him back center stage, where I think he was. And my book is following him through this enormous effort. There he is as a two-star general towards the end of the war in 1944. And we'll start at the beginning here. I sometimes have difficulty envisioning Groves as a baby, but indeed here he is over on the right with his two brothers over on the left. He was born in August of 1896. His father just had joined the Army as a chaplain. He was a minister before that. So he was born in Albany, New York. His father was a minister. And his father joins the Army and becomes a chaplain. And thus, young Leslie really grows up in the Army. He's on Army bases here and there as his father gets presented. And he decides that he wants to be in the Army, and the best way to do that is to go to West Point and become a graduate and be an officer. Now, I learned a lot in many different respects, and one thing about West Point 100 years ago, it was very, very difficult to get in. And many of the people who did get in had already gone to college for maybe 1 year or 2 years or sometimes 4 years. And Groves himself failed a couple of times beforehand, failed the test. And he went to the University of Washington for 1 year and to MIT for about 2 years before he got into West Point. So he was originally in the class of 1920 and graduated early because of the pressure of World War I. So he became the class of November 1918. They kind of pushed these classes through very quickly. And he ended up 4th in his class. I'm sure if he had gone 4 years, he would have been number 1. I would have bet anything on it. He took it very seriously. And if you were near the top of your class at West Point, the almost automatic thing to do was to join the Army Corps of Engineers, which he did. West Point was founded as an engineering school, and for most of its history has been a very, very strong contributor to the nation's engineering projects. And Groves chose as his branch the engineers. And he's given assignments through the interwar period. He graduates as a second lieutenant, and it's a very, very slow process to go through the 20s and the 30s for any kind of advancement. He's given bigger and bigger things. He goes to he has many different assignments. He gets very good efficiency reports. He gets married. He has 2 kids. One of his assignments is in Nicaragua, and here he is with his family. And as we get closer and closer to what appears to be an inevitable situation of the United States going to war with Germany, he is given assignments to build depots, munitions plants, army camps, airfields, you name it. At one point, he has 1 million people under him. He's the Deputy Chief of Construction for the Corps of Engineers. And he's working on, simultaneously, 100 projects. One of the projects, and if you know anything else about Groves, it's often mentioned that he built the Pentagon, which he did with his pinky, I swear. He got it done in 16 months under budget, but that was just one of 100 things he's doing at the same time. Here he is sitting around the table, and they're deciding on how big the Pentagon should be. This guy on the left here, Brian Somerville, is another Army Corps of Engineer. He's been mentioned before. He is really a force of nature and ultimately Groves' boss. On September 17th, 1942, Groves was given the assignment of building the bomb. Previously, there had been another person chosen by the Army to head the Manhattan Project. The fellow in the middle, Vannevar Bush, and the guy on the right, James Conant, are basically FDR's kind of science advisors. And it's Bush who's really kind of pushing that, we got to move faster here. He's worried about the Germans. He's heard about what the British are up to. And he pushes George Marshall, Chief of Staff, to assign somebody to build a bomb. And they choose a guy named James Marshall, no relation to George. And he's another Corps of Engineers, West Point, class ahead of Leslie Groves. And Leslie Groves is basically his boss within the Corps of Engineers. So he's looking over the shoulder at what Marshall is doing or not doing. And finally Bush says, we got to move faster. We need somebody else. And he goes to Marshall and he goes to Somerville and basically says, give us your best man. And the best man happens to be Leslie Groves. Now, I have a sentence in the book that the secret to finding a place in history is being at the right place at the right time. But you don't get there by accident. So Groves really becomes, I think, the indispensable man. Other people could have done it. This guy Somerville could have done it. I think the secret to the whole business is the Corps of Engineers. The mentality of these people is such that no project is too big. They take it on, they salute, and we're off to the races. And that's what exactly happened on September 17th, when Groves takes enormous decisions in the first few days. And I wondered before, how he was able to do all of this, and he's looking over Marshall's shoulder. His two bosses are basically Chief of Staff Marshall and Secretary of War Stimson. They've got a million responsibilities, each of them, and they delegate this to Groves and tell him, go for it as fast as you can. And in the first few days, Groves buys or takes over Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And this is where the center of the Manhattan Project starts out. It's going to be the place of uranium enrichment. There's a great story. It's probably true. It has to be true. FDR is told this program is probably going to cost hundreds of millions or maybe $1 billion. So he has the senator from Tennessee, McKellar, come into the office. And he says to McKellar, Senator, you think you could, and it has to be secret, you think you can help me hide about $1 billion secret project? And McKellar says, absolutely, Mr. President. Where in Tennessee would you like me to put it? It's got to be a true story. So, anyway, Oak Ridge becomes a gigantic facility, 56,000 acres, which are taken over by the Army. And that's where the uranium enrichment takes place for what will become the Little Boy bomb. They discover this other element, plutonium, and they discover that it can be also a good fuel for a bomb. And they have another site chosen by Groves in Hanford, Washington. And they build, all of these things are just monumental and enormous and huge. Now, I think that the overall cost in 1945 dollars is about $2.2 billion. That's how much the Manhattan Project cost. Transferred into today's dollars, maybe between 30 and 40 billion. So, it's pretty expensive, but it's not astronomical. So anyway, Groves has an open checkbook, and his attitude is, well, if I do, duplicate, triplicate, 2 or 3 things at the same time, trying to get to the same goal, one of them's got to work, and they all worked. He chooses Oak Ridge, he chooses Hanford, and he chooses, with Robert Oppenheimer, the place where the laboratory is going to be, and that's on a mesa in New Mexico, known as Los Alamos. They take over this ranch school after looking things over in the Southwest, and it becomes the place where the scientists, many of them, come. Not sure what they're working on, but Oppenheimer is a very effective recruiter. Groves chooses all of the important people. Oppenheimer is the classic case. Nobody thought Oppenheimer could, one guy said he can't run a hamburger stand. He's never done any administrative task other than running a graduate seminar. But Groves sees something in him that he sticks by him. So this is a quality that Groves had again and again and again. He could size you up in 5 minutes and know whether or not you could do the job or not. And the best case is Oppenheimer. And he went against everybody. He had absolute power and chose what became a very effective leader at Los Alamos. Of course, Oppenheimer wasn't alone, and they recruited dozens and dozens of other scientists, many of whom had already won Nobel Prizes. Here's 8. And there are more that won Nobel Prizes after the war. So the level of scientist was very high and was meant to be. The initial concern from Albert Einstein in those early years, 1939, 1940, and it really became an obsession with General Groves, what are the Germans up to? They've got some of the best scientists in the world. They've got this guy Heisenberg. And so this plagued them forever here until they finally intervened into the invasion of, after D-Day. They had a special team called Alsos, which was scientists in the military, tracking down these scientists and finding out actually the German bomb program there wasn't much to it. And finally, they relaxed. This is sort of at the end of 1944. One of the reasons that all of these people went into the program to begin with was the fear of a German bomb. What if Hitler got the bomb? There's some colorful characters here. The most colorful, perhaps, is Mo Berg. Here in his baseball uniform, he joins OSS and is given the assignment of assassinating Heisenberg. Didn't happen, but he's in the audience with a pistol in his pocket and cyanide tablets in the other one, and is told that if Heisenberg says anything about the atomic bomb, get up in the audience and shoot him dead, and then take the cyanide pill. So Mo does this, but doesn't assassinate Heisenberg and comes back but this is the level that we're talking about here. How can we stop the German program? We don't know anything about it, but maybe we're going to have to kill some scientists. We're going to have to bomb their laboratories. And we're going to have to, at the end of the war, round them up and capture them, which they did. And they put these, just to finish that story, they put these German scientists who headed this small-scale program, Heisenberg and others, in a country house in England called Farnhall. Of course, Groves had the place bugged, and they listened to the conversations of the Germans. Now, I only bring this up because it remains a contentious issue. Did the Germans know how to build a bomb or not? And there's a big literature on either side of this. The German scientists themselves claimed, falsely, I believe, they did know how to make a bomb, but they didn't want to tell Hitler because they thought, he was a madman. And we can't contribute to that. I think that's baloney. But anyway, that was the German argument soon after they were captured. And I think the real answer is they overlooked some things, as smart as they were. Heisenberg, they didn't know how to make a bomb. And when they hear over the radio on August 6, 1945, that the United States has dropped a bomb on Hiroshima, Heisenberg realizes that you only need this much highly enriched uranium. You don't need, tons of the stuff. So he miscalculated and basically, I think, did not know how to make a bomb. The United States went forward and as Conrad said, we pursued two different types of bombs. One was a uranium bomb, a highly enriched uranium, which came from the uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge. That was dropped on the Japanese. And at the same time, which I really find remarkable, almost on the same day, there's enough material for the two different types of bombs. And the plutonium bomb, they're less sure that it's going to work, so they have to have a test. And that becomes the test at so-called Trinity on July 16th, 1945. And Groves is, always anticipating what the next step is. He contacts the Army Air Forces and convenes what becomes the 509th Composite Group with Paul Tibbets in overall charge. And on the one hand, the first bomb is dropped by his plane, the Enola Gay, and that's the crew of it on the to the left. And then 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the second bomb, the plutonium bomb, is dropped on Nagasaki in a plane called Boxcar, and that's the crew from that. These are the two bombs. One is on the left, the little boy, basically a gun assembly where you take a piece of highly enriched uranium and shoot it down into another piece, and it blows up. They didn't need to test it. They knew it was going to work, and of course it did. On the right is the Fat Man, oops, a 5-ton behemoth that they have a little ball of 6 kilograms of plutonium inside of it, and rather than banging one piece of plutonium into another, which they found out won't work, we're going to have another design to compress this ball of plutonium inside that Fat Man, and then it will blow up. And of course, it did. And so August 6th, August 9th are the 2 days of the bombings of Japan. A couple days later, which Rich will go into, we have the end of the war. There's devastation at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Grove sends teams to find out what happened. And after the war, he's basically kind of pushed out the door and writes his own book, Now It Can Be Told, in 1962. Enjoys his children and grandchildren. I should say that one of his grandchildren lives here in New Orleans. So that's one connection to you. And here he is with his book. And in July 1970, he has a heart attack at a local country club, drops dead. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery, and then his wife lives out a bit longer. So that's a very abbreviated view of General Groves. We can go into some more. Conrad already summarized my view on the decision to use the bomb by saying that there was no decision. There is not one scrap of paper in the Truman Library archives that says, I, Harry Truman, authorized the use of the atomic bomb on Japan. It's not there, period. Truman, if he's the accidental president, he becomes president in April 1945. The Manhattan Project, under Groves's control and direction and focus, is a runaway train. There is so much momentum built up that this bomb, it's inevitable that this bomb is going to get used, come hell or high water. And the only thing that Truman could have ever done was to say no. And he wasn't going to say no to people like George Marshall or Henry Stimson. I mean, two figures that he has the utmost regard for. So after the war, Truman interjects himself, falsely, by writing a memoir that has him doing more than he ever did, and he has become the focus of a great deal of this historiography. So I think I'll stop right there and let Rich tell you more about the end of the war.
Thank you all for coming back this afternoon. And let me start by closing a circle from this morning. Mark Stoller talked about how the word appeasement is in fact not dishonorable but honorable. He mentioned specifically the context that many of us are familiar with was in our own domestic relations, that in our families we follow the policy of appeasement. And I certainly have followed that. The problem I've found is that my wife and children demand unconditional surrender. I've been doing this for a while. This topic is as big by analogy as the Pacific Ocean, and all I'm going to be able to do in the next several minutes is really skip across a couple of atolls in that ocean, organizing it primarily thematically rather than as a narrative. The first thing that I've found is really essential in these discussions is to get a proper framework on the context, and that means not starting in 1945, and particularly not starting in August 1945. If you'd shown these images to a representative group of Americans in 1945, they would have almost universally have recognized them. If they couldn't tell you precisely, they knew that they came out of China and that they symbolized the horrendous toll that had been the product of the Asia-Pacific War. We don't know how many people died in the war, but a reasonable and I think conservative estimate is the war killed about 25 million human beings. Of that toll, about 6 million were combatants, about 3 million are Chinese, about 2 million are Japanese. That means about 19 million non-combatants died. And of the 19 million, the sources are in pretty close agreement. The number of Japanese non-combatants who died was around 1 million, maybe a little more, maybe more likely a few less. Which means basically that for every Japanese non-combatant who died, at least 17 other non-combatants died in the war, of whom probably about 12 were Chinese. And I do not offer that set of numbers for the proposition that we should close our eyes or our hearts to the Japanese who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that we should understand that the war was an event of an enormous toll. Probably about 500,000 people were dying every month in 1945, and that we need to, above all, in my view, count all the dead. Now, the first sort of thematic point I want to touch upon is what was the U.S. trying to achieve? And we talked earlier, and Gerhard talked about unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender as basically a goal to make sure that the Germans and the Japanese understood they were defeated. Unconditional surrender, the implementation of which required a very fierce war, but particularly by 1945, unconditional surrender and the policy planning process for the post-war occupation and renovation of Germany and Japan. Unconditional surrender had been identified by State Department officials as absolutely foundational, that it would give the U.S. the authority to do things in the occupation of Japan that the normal international law of military occupation did not. It was therefore essential to the post-war transformation of Japan and Germany, and that the theory that it was merely a slogan that was dispensable, or that we could have dispensed with unconditional surrender and achieved the same results after the war, I believe is quite false. Now, I talked about this yesterday, American strategy being set by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and pointed out that they never really achieved more than an unstable compromise, and that compromise involved a conflict of these two visions. The Navy vision thinking that casualties was the absolutely essential issue, the Army vision that time was the essential issue that was going to undermine the will of the American people to see the war through to unconditional surrender. And as I pointed out, they achieved this unstable compromise and issued an order of May 1945. Now, what I want to touch on now is the fact that when they issued this order, they also signed off on a policy paper explaining the thinking behind the order. And the Joint Chiefs pointed out that the U.S. was attempting to achieve unconditional surrender to make sure that Germany and Japan never again posed a threat to peace. But the Joint Chiefs pointed out there were two fundamental obstacles that they saw that the U.S. faced. The first of which was that no Japanese government had ever surrendered in the history of Japan. And by Japanese count, that was 2,600 years. And the second problem was that they were not aware of any Japanese unit ever having surrendered in the entire course of the Asia-Pacific War. And therefore, the Joint Chiefs concluded that it was not predictable, foreseeable, certain that we would obtain an organized capitulation of both the Japanese government and the Japanese armed forces. And by identifying this as the problem, what they are saying is that this is the ultimate nightmare. It's not the invasion of Japan. It's the prospect that we'll be faced with defeating all of Japan's armed forces, which at that point they number as like 4 or 5 million men under arms, and by August of 45 it's going to be 6 million officially under arms in the home islands, on the Asian continent, and across the Pacific Islands. And this makes even an invasion of Japan look like only a down payment on the ultimate cost of ending the war with Japan. Now, they derived the plan, as I pointed out to you. It involves actually invading Japan, starting with Kyushu, that Admiral King does not actually accede to. And that's where we basically leave the U.S. story at this point to go to Japan. Starting in January 1945, Japanese leaders, both uniformed and military, were still convinced that Japan could salvage something from the war, because above all, they believed that although the Americans had tremendous material power, their morale was brittle and could be broken. And that if they could either defeat or inflict enormous casualties on that initial invasion of Japan, that the Americans would accede to something far short of unconditional surrender. In fact, would leave an old order intact in Japan. Now, what I also mentioned to you was that in implementing this strategy they called Ketsugo, Operation Decisive, they conducted a very shrewd appreciation of what the U.S. would do, and that they basically correctly identified Operation Olympic, that we would come to southern Kyushu, that we would land in certain specific locations on southern Kyushu, and they conducted a massive mobilization to make sure that they had the forces there that would meet the invasion and either defeat it or inflict enormous casualties. That's the basic national mobilization. They thought the secondary target was, in fact, exactly what was going to be Operation Coronet, but they prioritized preparing defenses on Kyushu. Now, the other element of the Japanese mobilization in 1945, which is not given, I think, to do it, is entitled to, is this whole notion of converting the population into a nation at arms. That in the spring of 1945, they create this National National Volunteer Corps, all males aged 15 to 60, all females aged 17 to 40, and they're going to add these people to actually formal units, perform combat support, and ultimately combat roles. And that these people, who will number about 20 million, are not going to have uniforms. Very few of them are going to have equipment. One Japanese officer talks about how he'd like to hope to give these civilians patches to put on their civilian clothing so that they could be identifiable as combatants. But as I mentioned, the thrust of this is that they're going to make it extremely difficult for any American serviceman on the shores of Japan to tell who is and who is not a combatant. It also basically converts every home in every Japanese city that holds a family into probably a barracks for 2 combatants and some non-combatants. And as Con pointed out the other day, there's a 5th Army intelligence officer who basically writes an assessment that says the pilots and aircrew should treat Japan as though there are no civilians. Now, the Japanese government has an imperial conference in June, decides there's no other policy besides Ketsugo, and it does one other thing that's extremely important. I talked about yesterday how the American campaign of blockade was ultimately aimed at inflicting a famine on Japan, and in the staff papers that prepared for the Japanese leaders in June 1945, they are clearly told in those papers that if the war goes on, and even if there's this stupendous battle against the invasion, and even if there's this stupendous loss of life due to the ongoing blockade and bombardment, and even if there is a negotiated peace to follow, even after that, there is going to be mass famine in Japan between late 1945 and 1946. So the leaders of Japan know clearly that the policy they're embarking on involves not merely all the casualties we've always talked about in terms of the conflict, but a mass of casualties from starvation after supposedly peace has descended. We were intercepting and decoding Japanese communications, both diplomatic and military, in enormous quantities in 1945. They were in 2 basic streams as they flowed to American policymakers. The first, called the Magic Diplomatic Summary, and the second, called the Magic Far East Summary, covering military affairs. The important point about the Magic Diplomatic Summary is it shows clearly that the Japanese government has sanctioned only one legitimate diplomatic enterprise, and that is a commission for the Japanese ambassador in Moscow, Sato Naotaki, to secure Soviet mediation to negotiate an end to the war, and they're not talking about unconditional surrender. And Sato, who himself is a former foreign minister, writes a series of dispatches that when you put them end to end and read them, read like what a lawyer would call a cross-examination on behalf of the Truman administration. He ridicules the notion the Japanese government, the Soviet government will lift a finger to help Japan, but he comes back repeatedly to a critical theme, which is that if Japan's effort is serious, they must provide a statement of terms to end the war. And the Japanese leaders, the Japanese foreign minister who's communicating with Sato, cannot provide a set of terms because the Japanese government never agrees on a set of terms to end the war. In exasperation, Sato sends messages to Tokyo in mid-July saying, look, the best Japan can hope for now is unconditional surrender modified to the extent that the imperial institution will take place. And what's interesting about this is that the editors who do this magic diplomatic summary, they clearly understand that this is really a critical message. And they set this up in the news sheet almost like they're going like this to the policymakers. Read this. This is very, very important. And Togo says, hell no. It's completely unacceptable. So basically, my view is that anyone reading that dispatch would believe that merely offering to preserve the imperial institution would not have secured the surrender of Japan. Now, I talked about, that's the date of the message, July 22nd. It's in the Magic Diplomatic Summary. That was in the public record from 1978. You can read a great deal of the literature on the end of the war, and you will not find it mentioned. And as I mentioned the other day, the Magic Far East Summary shows this enormous buildup of Japanese forces on Kyushu, and this reaches a critical mass with Admiral King deciding to bring on a confrontation over whether Operation Olympic should go forward or not. And once again, that's Olympic as it was planned, with only those three figures down there in southern Kyushu representing the Japanese units, and this is the back and forth between King and the other members and Admiral Nimitz. And now let me shift into the situation in Japan as we encounter Hiroshima and Nagasaki Soviet intervention. Above all, in terms of assessing what happens in Japan, I would emphasize that ending the war required two steps. Both, someone must decide the Japanese government will surrender, and the Japanese armed forces have to comply with that surrender, which is exactly the point the American Joint Chiefs of Staff made back in May and April. When we look at this question and we ask what's going to motivate decision makers to make those decisions, a lot of paper has been created over the issues of whether it is atomic bombs or Soviet intervention. A very passionate, very contentious debate. And having looked at this now for a long time, I would urge that we have to think of it as three different factors that are really important in this final decision by Japanese decision makers. One of which is the atomic bomb or atomic bombs, one of which is Soviet intervention, but the third is a fear of an internal revolt, or what's referred to euphemistically frequently in the Japanese records of this period as the domestic situation, domestic circumstances. And as you go through and look at all of these issues, my view is, as both a historian and as an attorney, is that we look at what people said and did and what's recorded at the time as being the most reliable indicators as to what motivated them to make those decisions, not what people recorded or said days, months, years, decades later. And when we look at that, from that viewpoint, we find out that after Hiroshima, the reaction of the Japanese armed forces was as follows. The Imperial Army took the stance that they would not concede the Americans had an atomic bomb until there was an investigation. The Imperial Navy took the stance that because fissionable material is so difficult to make, as Robert just talked about, the Americans can't have that much of it. They therefore can't make that many bombs, or the bombs can't be that powerful, or maybe the Americans will be dissuaded from using atomic weapons by international pressure. Now, there's a lot of literature that claims that because the Japanese did not instantly surrender after Hiroshima, that the bombs had no effect. And I believe that the correct way to look at this is that the Japanese leadership, because of their own atomic bomb program, understood both conceptually the existence of a potential atomic weapon and also pragmatically that producing fissionable material was such an incredible industrial, technological, engineering feat that their real position was not that they discounted the fact that an atomic bomb might exist, but they did not believe until they had further proof that the U.S. had an arsenal of powerful atomic weapons. Now, during the night of August 8th, August 9th, the Soviet Union intervenes. It's a massive attack that Raina talked about, and it is entitled to all the superlatives it has received in terms of operational planning and execution. But I would add that the Japanese Wangchun Army was merely a shadow of what it once had been. Once it had been the foremost element of the Imperial Japanese Army. 19 some divisions had been stripped out of it to go fight the Americans in 1944-45 or to meet the invasion. And although numerically they had a unit count of 24 divisions and 9 infantry brigades and 2 tank brigades, Japanese staff officers calculated the combat effectiveness of the Japanese Army was the equivalent of 6 2/3 divisions in 1938. And they were smashed by the Soviets, as Raina talked about. So what was the reaction of the Japanese Army upon learning of this attack? Well, first of all, the fog of war. They did not fully understand the totality of the Soviet offensive. They didn't even know that that whole huge offensive coming in from the West had actually been launched. But the reaction at Imperial General Headquarters was as follows. The Vice Chief of Staff of the Imperial Army, a general named Kawabe Torishiro, who heretofore had been one of the most, if not the foremost voice for the proposition that keeping the Soviets out of the war was absolutely indispensable to continuing the war, sits down to draft a plan for a reaction. And his plan is that Japan will continue the war. And not only that, that the Imperial Army should look to eliminating any vestige whatsoever of civilian participation in the government and rule through Imperial General Headquarters. And the War Minister, Anami Kurachiyo, who is arguably the most powerful man in Japan, apart from the Emperor, endorses that as the policy of the Imperial Army. To me, that's pretty powerful evidence about what the Imperial Army's reaction was to Soviet intervention at that point. Cutting through the thicket of this whole day of August 9th, 1945, the essential points are as follows. The Nagasaki bomb reaches an inner cabinet called the Big Six, which is deliberating on what to do. It's called the Big Six because there are 6 members, and they are the effective government, legal government of Japan. And if the Japanese High Command believed that there was a question about whether the Americans had an arsenal of atomic weapons, the Nagasaki bomb suggested what the answer was. And by the afternoon of August 10th, the War Minister Anami is telling a cabinet meeting that the Americans have 100 atomic bombs, they can drop 3 a day, and the next target may be Tokyo. This is a hell of a pep talk for continuing the war. But the Big Six are never able to agree on terms to end the war that would have been acceptable to the U.S. And although they were prepared to ostensibly accept the Potsdam Declaration of July 26th, in which the U.S. and its allies defined what unconditional surrender was, they added these 4 additional terms. You can read it on the slide. The most important of which, of course, is no occupation of Japan. That there's going to be no mechanism to ensure that the post-war reforms can be implemented in Japan? Well, the key moment comes. It is the intervention of Emperor Hirohito. The Japanese government hasn't decided to surrender on any acceptable terms, and the emperor is going to intervene. What motivates Emperor Hirohito? Once again, if you go back and you read through everything, and I would emphasize that you can't be naive about this, what the official minutes of some of these meetings say obviously was subject to be manipulated. But what to me is really telling is when you get down to the second and third level, the horse holders, the staff officers, the people who are present at the time, who are talking to the decision makers, who record in diary or memos at that time what these people are saying, and you go back and you look at that, you find the emperor very consistently talks about three things. He talks about his loss of faith in Ketsugo. And remember, this is the overarching political military strategy that the Japanese ostensibly are pursuing to secure a successful end of the war. And he says in conjunction with that he's lost faith with the armed forces. And secondly, he comes back to the issue of conventional and atomic bombing repeatedly. And finally, he talks repeatedly through these days about the domestic situation, this fear of internal revolt. And when I went back and recounted again, even since I did my book, I was struck again by when you go through all the statements made by all the high mucky-mucks, the emperor, the senior staff officers, there are at least a dozen different occasions in which this specific point is raised as a reason why Japan should quit the war. That ultimately, what drives Japan's decision-making is not threats from without, but a threat from within. Now, I said that we need two steps. The emperor has effectively ordered the government to end the war, but that still leaves the issue of what Japan's armed forces are going to do. And there is a long and lamentable history from at least 1931 to 1945 of Japanese officers disobeying orders, even from highest authorities, notably in China, among other places. And the Japanese Navy minister, a fellow named Yone, is going to tell American interrogators shortly afterwards that the most anxious period he spent as Navy minister was from August 14th to August 23rd. And basically what he's talking about, he is profoundly concerned about whether the armed forces are going to comply with the surrender. Now, a great deal of attention has been given to a coup d'etat attempt that takes place in Tokyo on the night of August 14th to August 15th. It's tremendously theatrical. The Imperial Palace is actually seized by the coup plotters. It's been given a lot of attention, but in my view, the fact is the emperor had crushed the will of his leadership in Tokyo, military leadership in Tokyo, particularly the war minister Anami, who is not going to support the coup, and this dies out. A much more serious issue arises and is foretold by this same fellow Kawabe I talked about before, the Vice Chief of Staff. He records in his diary at the time that after they get word that the emperor has effectively ordered the government to surrender, one of the other senior officers, another general in Imperial General Headquarters, comes to Kawabe and says that even with the imperial order, he does not think the overseas commanders are going to comply. And then right as if on cue, the senior commander in China and the southern area, who are the two of the three senior overseas commanders, send messages to Tokyo saying, hell no, we won't comply with the surrender. And we pick those up in the intercepts. Then on top of that, when the Soviets imprudently launch a landing on an island in the Kuril Islands, the one place where the Japanese were really prepared, and there's a ferocious battle, and for a while, because Soviet amphibious capability is so limited, it appears as though the Soviets might very well be tossed back into the sea. There's a frantic episode in Tokyo. They issue orders to the local commanders in the Kurils to cease fighting. They even send an order from the emperor to cease fighting. and for quite a while they don't cease fighting. And as Professor Hasegawa has pointed out, this creates a great anxiety, if not panic, in Tokyo that if there is a, quote, victory over the Soviets in the Kurils, it could start an unraveling of the whole compliance with the surrender by the armed forces. But at the end of the day, the armed forces do comply. And while we can itemize what the emperor was thinking, I think, pretty clearly, we're dealing with a great many more actors and other individuals in terms of the armed forces, both in the homeland and overseas. And I think the basic points we can derive from that is that, first of all, those who are in the homeland who directly dealt with the emperor have their morale and their will to continue crushed by the emperor's decision to end the war. The guys who are overseas, however, these are guys who are not going to be impressed with atomic bombs. First of all, there's no likely target we're going to drop an atomic bomb on in these overseas areas, no cities that are occupied by Japanese. They have no great idea about what the bomb is like. They do understand Soviet intervention. And I certainly don't minimize the importance of Soviet intervention with respect to the compliance of the Japanese armed forces with this surrender. Another point I would like to underline with respect to the significance of Soviet intervention is when this imperial conference takes place, in which the emperor makes his decision to end the war, before he makes his decision, the chief of staff of the Imperial Army, General Umizo, talks to him and says specifically that all Soviet intervention is, as he puts it, unfavorable. There's a man for understatement. He says it does not invalidate Ketsugo. We can still continue the war. So the emperor is told by his chief of staff that Soviet intervention is not a reason to end the war. The other aspect about Soviet intervention that I think you need to bear in mind, and goes also to this issue of counting all the dead, is that it produces an enormous number of Japanese deaths in Northeast Asia. In the past, there's been a lot of dispute about what the numbers are. There was a recent book by Andrew Barchet from University of California at Berkeley, and he had actual access to Soviet archival records. And based on those records, he came up with a figure that at least 62,000 Japanese POWs will perish in Soviet captivity after hostilities ostensibly cease, and that at least approximately 180,000 Japanese civilians die in Soviet captivity. And both those POWs and those civilians are those that the Soviets acknowledge that they had in their custody. It's estimated typically that between 300 and perhaps as many as 500,000 Japanese perish in Soviet captivity or remain unaccounted for after the Soviets overrun Northeast Asia. Now, when I started my talk, I showed you this slide. And I think probably to a person out here, you assumed that this was a scene from Hiroshima, from Nagasaki, or maybe possibly from one of the fire raids against cities like Tokyo. This is Manila in February 1945. The official number from the war crimes trials of Filipinos who died is about 100,000. I think that number is high, but certainly in the tens of thousands. It was a horrendous event, but only one part of the total story of the end of the Asia-Pacific War. Let me conclude with the following point. Much of the literature that's written about this episode treats the whole thing as though we're sailing towards this certain destination, that we're going to get the surrender of Japan, which is typically viewed as one step rather than this compliance of the government and compliance of the armed forces. In my view, when you go through all this evidence and think about it carefully and remember what the costs are everywhere on this, what we got in August 1945 was a miraculous deliverance. Thank you.
Before we begin Q&A, I'll let you know if you sneak out early, it doesn't mean the bus is going to leave any earlier. Con, do you have any comments before we open it to the floor, sir?
No, I know there's a lot of questions out there. Let's start it off.
Great. Please raise your hand, and I'll give you, sir, right in front.
Professor Frank, at the Potsdam Conference, an ultimatum, at the Potsdam Conference, the ultimatum was issued to the Japanese. And in the discussions there, quite a number of Truman's military and civilian advisors, including Secretary of State Stimson, suggested that he include in that message a guarantee that the emperor would remain in his position and he himself would be personally safe. Truman was advised by Burns not to include that, so it was not included. Yet, after the bombs were dropped, Truman did accept the conditional surrender of Japan. The surrender message, as you know, specified that they surrendered only if the emperor remained on the throne. Why didn't he offer to give that to the Japanese before? Because there were numbers of people at the time and since who believed that the Japanese may well have accepted a surrender if the emperor were guaranteed.
Let me start that by pointing out the whole issue of what exactly was unconditional surrender, and was the surrender of Japan unconditional or not. There are two ways that you could have unconditional surrender. One was a blank check, which is what the Germans got. They were given no conditions or stipulations whatsoever. They just signed, "I surrender, do with us what you will." I think the best interpretation of what happened with Japan was that because Japanese propaganda was that unconditional surrender actually meant the extermination of the Japanese race and the extinction of the Japanese nation, that unconditional surrender, the Potsdam Proclamation, was designed to give a set of terms, but it was best described as, these are the terms: there is no negotiation. Blank check, no negotiation. Defining what was going to happen, and basically it said that the leaders who have caused this war will be held accountable, but ordinary Japanese will not only not be held accountable, but will be given a bunch of freedoms, and Japan will be restored to its sovereignty after the Allies are satisfied that it's become peaceful. Now, with respect to the specific point about the emperor, it's true that Secretary Stimson believed and urged that they make some specific stipulation. This was before that July 22nd message. Also, it's frequently commented that Secretary Burns, who's usually cast as the devilish figure in this, is the guy who gets this stripped out of it. If you go back, however, through the records, what you find out is the Joint Chiefs of Staff had a look at the draft of the Potsdam Proclamation from Secretary Stimson that had the provision about guaranteeing the imperial institution. And they gave it to their, effectively what they called their think tank, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee. And the Joint Strategic Survey Committee came back and said, well, the way this is drafted up, it's a big problem. It contains ambiguity. It can be read as though by guaranteeing the imperial institution, we've already decided to try and execute the emperor, or it can be interpreted as a guarantee that Japan will remain under this emperor system. Neither one of those outcomes are satisfactory, and the Joint Chiefs recommend that. On that basis, the Joint Chiefs recommended to the President that that be stripped out of the Potsdam Proclamation. So between, it seems to me, what the Joint Chiefs and the Strategic Survey Committee say, and the intercept that tells us that even an offer of preserving the imperial institution, that's why that comes out and why it's decided that it's not going to achieve that end. Now, what then happens is this. When the Potsdam Proclamation is announced, the thing that's really revealing is that in this Big Six I've talked about, the inner cabinet, that when they split, the three individuals who, from our standpoint, are the moderates, two of them seize upon the Potsdam Proclamation not as being too stiff, but as indicating that they're on the right track. You see, the American will is already collapsing. They're already giving all these additional terms even before the first drop of blood is shed. So the Potsdam Proclamation itself provides an incentive for those in Japan who wish to go ahead. when the Japanese do surrender, and after the surrender they say that, well, they have not surrendered unconditionally, the response of the U.S. government, as John Dower points out, is no, you have surrendered unconditionally. And as to the status of the emperor, there is no specific guarantee about the emperor in the Potsdam Proclamation or in any other communication by the U.S. government. We say that when the Japanese respond initially that they want the emperor to be recognized under the Japanese law, which is sort of a code word for that we acknowledge the emperor is supreme not only of the Japanese government but over the occupation commander. We respond with the Burns note saying no, he'll be subordinate to. But there's no guarantee that the emperor will go on, and when the Japanese insist after the surrender that we've made some guarantee to the emperor, the answer the U.S. gives is no, and MacArthur's told that he is not to do anything about it until he gets advice from Washington. And they don't really make a decision about what to do with the emperor until December 45 into the first months of 46. So there's a guarantee only that we will give the Japanese the rights we've talked about originally under the Atlantic Charter. We don't guarantee them anything else with respect to the imperial system.
Gentlemen, we'll go to your right here in the purple shirt.
I want to say thank you. I enjoyed the speech. My question is, if we didn't have the atomic bombs and kind of hearing everything, how long would the war in Japan have lasted? Would it have stopped with Olympic? Would it have gone into Honshu? Would we have had to have the Soviets come in? Or how long would it have gone?
I don't think anyone can say how long it would have gone on, because we don't know at what critical point the Japanese leadership, and it was in their realm to make that final decision as to when they would have collapsed. My speculative view is this, that the more I look at this issue of the domestic situation and fear of internal revolt, that as they got down into the fall of 45 and they reached a crisis with respect to food, and the cumulative effects of blockade and bombardment are creeping in, and they believe that there's a likelihood of the government collapsing from within, that at some point along that path they might well have surrendered. But the cost of that may very well have been this enormous cost of the famine and starvation that's going to affect Japan into the first several years of the post-war occupation. But none of us can say. One of the other points, if you want to argue this back and forth, is these guys who staged that coup in Tokyo and on the 14th, 15th. What if they have another couple weeks to put together something? What if they start collaborating with other members of the diehards who want to continue and carry out the sort of coup d'etat that was attempted in Tokyo in 32 or 36? I mean, who knows what's going to happen at that point?
I gave a presentation in Tokyo about the firebombing of Tokyo to a Japanese audience, and got some interesting responses. One was from a colonel whose parents had been killed in the firebombing, and said that he was a soldier, and he said, as a soldier, I now understand why you Americans did what you did. But at the end of the presentation, a Japanese historian got up and said, in his estimation, the Japanese would have surrendered in the fall, that they just could not have sustained, late fall, they could not have sustained the resistance, the fear of internal revolt. But he said by then the Soviets would have had a foothold in Hokkaido. And he said, in the end, we Japanese must thank you Americans for the firebombing and the atomic bombing, because it made us surrender before the Soviets had a foothold in Hokkaido and would have turned us into a North Japan and South Japan like North and South Korea, which is a strange, it was not the perspective I expected to get from the Japanese.
Mike, you get the next question in the center, gentlemen.
Straight in front of y'all, gentlemen. Mr. Norris, you said that the Manhattan Project cost $30 to $40 billion in today's dollars. You described that as expensive, but not astronomical. I think you missed your calling. You should run for Congress. I have read that the United States has built over 70,000 nuclear weapons. Can you comment on that number and the number that still exists around today in all the countries of the world, and also the broken arrows? I think there's about 12 of them that we have lost and not recovered or something in that neighborhood.
Yeah, well, on my day job, I follow this rather closely, and that 70,000, I've modified it slightly. That was my number to begin with. It's now down to about 69,000 or something. But anyway, after the war, the United States, went to town and built a nuclear weapon for every conceivable mission. It was the thing to have. And the Army wanted this number, and the Air Force wanted this, and the Navy wasn't going to left out, so there was an enormous competition among the services for every conceivable type of nuclear weapon, which we went ahead and built, all within the context of, the Russians are coming, they're doing the same thing, the Americans are coming, so we have a very intense arms race, which peaked in the late 60s for us. We had more than 32,000 at the same time. Mercifully, we had arms control treaties, which got things lower and lower, and a host of unilateral actions by the professional military themselves, who said, these things are too expensive to run. I can use the money somewhere else, and I can have a usable weapon. So, the Navy got rid of a whole bunch of stuff. The Army's out of this business totally. And we're down to a stockpile of about, 5,000 right now. And we have, with the Soviet Union and now Russia, a series of treaties and relationships where, I think the two of us have handled this problem pretty well. I mean, we've both been responsible stewards at making the weapons safe, and you bring up what are called broken arrows, which is the military term for an accident. A certain kind of thing has to happen for it to be an accident, and the United States has had 32 of them, and we know what they are, and there's a good story around each one of them. But with the shrinking arsenal and less logistic movement and improved safety features in the weapons themselves, it's a much safer arsenal. We've tried to teach the rest of the world, first the Soviets, you got to do the same thing, you got to make them safe, we don't want any accidents, all kinds of notifications, and I think they did that. But what about the Indians and the Pakistanis? Do you think they're having the same kind of searching investigation of their own weapons about how safe they are? And that's scary stuff, and we just don't know what goes on inside of that. And so the bomb has spawned all kinds of things. An arms race that was a close call a couple of times, very close call in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The more we look at that, the more we find out new things that almost happened, and we got through by the skin of our teeth. And but now we have a host of other problems. We have an environmental legacy that they made a mess. Don't bother me. The Russians are coming. But now there's the cleanup costs of all of that, and all of these other countries that want nuclear weapons and thinks that having them will somehow garner them more security, which ultimately they won't. So I don't know. Maybe that answers your question a little bit.
I want to, before we continue, I want to apologize for the neighbors next door. We have asked, and I think it's gone a little bit lower, but especially to our panelists who are the closest to the noise, thank you for tolerating this, and we will not rush to finish our program.
Let me interject on this note. Something I really want to have us address a little bit, and I've talked with Barton Bernstein, and I think Stan also. One really important point is, what would have most likely, or at least with some reasonable probability, have occasioned a decision not to use the bomb in the summer of 1945? And the one path I can see that this might, in fact, have happened is this. When the bomb was developed and the scientists briefed the policymakers on it, the policymakers understood the bomb as simply a bigger bang, a huge blast of high explosives, which they understood. What the scientists understood was that when you detonate a nuclear weapon, you get radiation, But they thought or convinced themselves that the radiation from that initial detonation would be a moot point because anyone close enough to get a fatal dose of radiation would already be dead by blast or heat. What the scientists did not grasp or evaded grasping was what we now call fallout. Fallout, unlike blast, is something like a poison. And there was a very strong legal and moral barrier about the use of poison gas. Had the policymakers, Mr. Truman, Mr. Stimson in particular, and probably General Marshall, understood that the bomb was going to be something akin to a gigantic poison gas weapon, they would have, at a minimum, as Bart said, have a robust discussion over whether they were prepared to use the weapon or not. But they were not told that. The scientists, and their various explanations as to why they did or did not understand this or did not wish to understand this, didn't share that information, didn't understand that information. And that is the one key thing, I think, in which if there was not going to be the use of a bomb, that would have been the rationale.
You have to understand that we were going to use poison gas on the beaches in '46, so I'm not sure how that conversation would have gone.
Yeah.
Well, there was a distinction there because Marshall was talking about using poison gas, but only at point targets like bunkers, or not like a mass spraying of poison gas or whatever here. And Truman, by the way, as you know, turned that down. It got to Truman's desk in June of '45, and he said no.
So just one quick comment. I mean, to use the word decision, I mean, there's something the matter with that word. And the historiography of this whole issue has revolved around this word decision. Decision means, you know, a collaborative discussion, weighing the pros and cons. None of that happened. None of that happened at all. So even to use the word decision is, you know, a misnomer. And as I said before, there was no decision, basically. There was all of this momentum generated by the building the bomb itself. A lot of people's careers were tied up in all of this, and they saw that, you know, it could be the winning weapon and so on and so forth. So I think we have to, if they had really been a decision, I mean, they would have had to confront all of these issues that were just brought up by Rich, and, you know, it would have been a searching, what a decision really is, a weighing of this and that and the other thing, and coming to some conclusion. None of that happened. None of that happened at all.
All right, folks, we have a couple questions in the front or middle here.
This is for Dr. Crane. You mentioned that President Truman did not make any decision regarding the use of the atomic bomb. If you look at Potsdam Conference, that's when he was informed the Trinity test results were better than expected. And he wrote on a small piece of paper, basically in a coded form, saying that when Manhattan drops on Japan, it will fold. And he also advised the High Command to wait until the Potsdam is finished before the first bomb is dropped. So I would argue that that indeed was a decision by the President of the United States to make use of the bomb implicitly.
Well, I can't disagree with that interpretation, but he didn't. That was the way everybody was going. It was easy to ride the rail with everybody else. I mean, it would be much harder to turn around and say, don't use it. So you can interpret it that way, that he decided to agree with everybody else. But again, I think the decision was, he just kind of accepted a decision that had already been made.
The actual order to the South Pacific forces was done on July 25th, with the signature of General Handy, who was the Deputy Chief of Staff. Marshall was in Europe. And the phraseology, or the phrase that was used in there, done by General Groves, of course, was basically what came to be known as pre-delegation. Keep using the bombs as made ready. As made ready. As soon as you have one, boom, keep going. Truman finally interjected himself into that and stopped the pre-delegation order. But they would have been continually used until told not to. And the next bomb was ready in August 17th, probably. Groves tells Marshall. And Groves, being a good officer here, has them lined up all the way to Christmas. I mean, one every 10 days. Because now plutonium is pouring out of Hanford, and he knows how much is needed, and he can determine a schedule that will have a bomb ready every 10 days or so, three a month, as long as you want. And, two do the trick, but the third one is ready. The third one's ready, and the crews are ready. He's got, his own Air Force ready to go. And Truman, who's, out in the middle of the Atlantic when the bomb goes off, the first bomb goes off in Hiroshima, and he's still kind of a neophyte in terms of all these responsibilities, and, shame on FDR for only telling him nothing for a whole host of issues, and then dropping dead and leaving Truman alone with all of these responsibilities. And, he grew into the job and has become viewed as a very effective president. But these first few months, he's adrift and he knows it. And he's got to rely on people who know a lot more than he does, people like Marshall, people like Stimson. And he finds out about this runaway train here, and as Con said, let's jump aboard, and other people's decisions have it going forward, and I'm on board, and the bomb is used.
Let me, that gets to sort of a nuance. Barton Bernstein articulated this concept. He called it the implementation of a policy that had been decided basically at the moment that they ordered the bomb to be made. The assumption that was embedded in that original order was that if the bomb was ready, it would be used. And playing off of what Stan has said, if you look at Mr. Truman's situation in 1945, he takes over, he basically knows nothing. He says, my basic policy is to execute the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt. One area where he gets fairly consistent advice is from the military side. He gets much more divided advice with respect to diplomacy. If you look at where Mr. Truman is sitting in 1945, he is told, or gets the clear impression from Stimson and Marshall, that this was FDR's legacy, that the bomb, when it was ready, would be used. He's declared he's going to execute the legacy. Why should he spend a lot of time on this issue now when he's got so much other stuff to deal with? But Truman came to have a very powerful sense of personal responsibility over this. We see it as early as a couple days after Hiroshima, when he talks in a cabinet meeting about killing 100,000 people, which we now know came directly out of an intercept from the Imperial Navy, giving that figure as the deaths at Hiroshima. He talks about, he was horrified at, as he put it, killing all those kids. And in later years, Truman famously would be known as saying he never lost any sleep over the decision. But if you probe deeper into Truman's psyche, of which there's a good deal of evidence, I think he was thinking on two levels. The first of which was, of the options I was given, I made the best, or as Stimson would have said, least abhorrent choice. Of the horror of what was inflicted, he never got over that or felt he could escape from the responsibility for that.
The very last question is the young lady to your left.
Hi, I just want to ask if they invaded Japan, would they have executed Hirohito, and what would the fallout have been to the American servicemen?
That's actually a good question. That when you, as riveted as we are on the horrors of the air campaign, the blockade, ultimately atomic weapons, Soviet intervention, if you think about what would have been happening had we actually put boots on the ground on Kyushu, the horrendous nature of that fight, not only against the Japanese uniformed military, but against basically a population. We have a preview of that in Okinawa, which has absolutely horrendous effects with respect to civilians. The bitterness that would be instilled on both sides over such a fight, it's hard to see how we might have continued forward with what effectively was a pretty liberal and loose series of occupation policies in Japan, or that the Japanese would have felt remotely the same about the U.S. As we entered the occupation of Japan. It's, you know, the horror of that, the possibility of the Soviets seizing Hokkaido. I mean, you can go on and make lists of all the horrors to follow.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, please. Thanks to our panel, Dr. Crane, Dr. Norris, and Rich Frank for rounding out our program.